The Monster of Tenerife, the Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre story. Between 2007 and 2012, Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre, known as the Monster of Tenerife, systematically hunted motorcycle taxi drivers across multiple Colombian departments. Using charm and charisma to gain his victims' trust, he would lure them to isolated locations where he would torture and kill them in one of the most methodical and sadistic ways ever documented. His reign of terror claimed the lives of at least 30 people, making him one of Colombia's most prolific serial killers. To understand the emergence of Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre as a killer, we must first examine the Colombia of the 2000s and early 2010s. The country was still grappling with the aftermath of decades of internal conflict, drug violence, and social instability. In rural and semi-urban areas, motorcycle taxis had become an essential form of transportation, connecting remote communities with urban centers. These motorcycle taxi drivers, known locally as mototaxistas, were typically young men from working-class backgrounds who used their motorcycles to earn a modest living by transporting passengers between towns and cities. The nature of their work made them particularly vulnerable. They regularly picked up strangers, traveled to isolated areas, and often worked alone without backup or security. The northern departments of Colombia, including Magdalena, Atlántico, and Cesar, were experiencing rapid economic growth driven by agriculture, mining, and trade through Caribbean ports. This prosperity brought increased mobility and migration, creating perfect conditions for a predator who understood how to exploit the trust and desperation of those working in the informal transportation sector. Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre was born on September 30, 1980 in Valledupar, the capital of Cesar Department and center of Vallenato music culture. From his early years, he would develop the charismatic personality and persuasive speaking ability that would later become his primary weapons in selecting and approaching victims. What set Ramírez apart from other serial killers was his remarkable ability to appear trustworthy and engaging. Witnesses and survivors described him as loquacious and charming, someone who could quickly establish rapport with strangers. This charisma allowed him to gain the confidence of motorcycle taxi drivers who might otherwise be suspicious of potential passengers. According to later psychological analysis, Ramírez exhibited clear antisocial tendencies and psychopathic behavior patterns. However, these traits were masked by his outward charm and ability to manipulate social situations to his advantage. His intelligence and planning ability would prove to be lethal combinations in his criminal career. Ramírez developed a systematic approach to selecting and victimizing motorcycle taxi drivers that demonstrated he specifically targeted motorists between 19 and 30 years of age, focusing on those who measured no more than 1.70 meters tall and weighed less than 60 kilograms. This victim selection criteria was calculated and deliberate. Ramírez chose smaller, lighter victims specifically to make them easier to overpower and control. His methodology revealed a killer who had thought carefully about the physical logistics of his crimes and wanted to minimize the risk of resistance from his victims. Ramírez's approach was both simple and devastatingly effective. He would position himself at motorcycle taxi stands in various towns and cities, presenting himself as a regular passenger needing transportation. Using his charisma and gift for conversation, he would quickly generate trust with drivers who were eager for business. Once Ramírez had selected a victim and negotiated a fare, he would request to be taken to carefully chosen locations on the outskirts of the cities where he operated. These destinations were always isolated areas where the crimes could be committed without witnesses or interruption. During the journey, Ramírez would engage his victims in friendly conversation, further lowering their guard and establishing a false sense of security. As a passenger riding behind the driver, he was perfectly positioned to launch a surprise attack when they reached their destination. When they arrived at the predetermined location, Ramírez would suddenly grab the driver by the throat and begin suffocating them. However, his goal was not to kill them immediately, but to render them unconscious while keeping them alive for what would follow. What happened next revealed the true depths of Ramírez's sadism and psychological pathology. After rendering his victims unconscious through partial suffocation, he would carefully tie them up using a complex system of ropes and restraints. According to forensic evidence and witness testimony, Ramírez would hang his victims from trees by their wrists, waist, and ankles in a configuration designed to cause a slow, agonizing death. The victim's own body weight would gradually compress their airways and restrict circulation, causing death over the course of several days. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Ramírez would remain in the area to watch his victims die slowly. This behavior indicated that the prolonged suffering of his victims was a crucial component of his psychological gratification. He derived pleasure not just from killing, but from witnessing the extended agony of those he had captured. Like many serial killers, Ramírez collected trophies from his victims as a way of reliving and savoring his crimes. Police confirmed that he systematically kept personal objects from each victim, including wallets, identity cards, cell phones, helmets, and other personal items. These trophies served multiple psychological purposes for Ramírez. They allowed him to relive the murders after the fact, provided proof of his accomplishments, and may have helped him maintain a sense of control and dominance over his victims even after their deaths. The systematic nature of his trophy collection also demonstrated the organized and methodical aspects of his criminal behavior. This was not the work of a disorganized killer acting on impulse, but rather the calculated actions of someone who planned his crimes carefully and took pleasure in their aftermath. Ramírez operated across multiple municipalities and cities throughout northern Colombia, including Tenerife in Magdalena Department, Sabana Larga in Atlántico, Agua Chica in Cesar, Santa Marta on the Caribbean coast, his birthplace of Valledupar, and Puerto Wilches in Santander Department. This geographic distribution demonstrated both his mobility and his strategic thinking. By operating across multiple jurisdictions, Ramírez made it more difficult for law enforcement agencies to recognize patterns in his crimes and coordinate their investigations. The choice of locations also revealed his intimate knowledge of the region's transportation networks and isolated areas suitable for committing his crimes. His familiarity with these areas suggested either extensive travel experience or careful reconnaissance of potential hunting grounds. As the number of missing and murdered motorcycle taxi drivers began to accumulate across northern Colombia, law enforcement agencies gradually recognized they were dealing with a serial killer. The similar victim profiles, consistent methodology, and geographic concentration of crimes all pointed to a single perpetrator. The investigation was complicated by several factors that initially hindered progress. The victims were from working-class backgrounds whose disappearances were not always immediately reported to authorities. Many families assumed their missing relatives had simply traveled to other cities for work opportunities. Additionally, the crimes occurred across multiple departmental boundaries, requiring coordination between different police forces and jurisdictions. In Colombia's fragmented law enforcement system of the early 2010s, this coordination was often difficult to achieve effectively. As the scope and sophistication of Ramírez's crimes became apparent, Colombian authorities sought assistance from international law enforcement agencies with expertise in serial crime investigation. The FBI and UK investigation agencies were brought in to help profile the killer and develop strategies for his capture. This international collaboration represented a significant development in Colombian criminal justice, acknowledging that the country needed specialized expertise to deal with complex serial crimes. The foreign agencies provided psychological profiling, investigative techniques, and analytical support that proved crucial to the eventual resolution of the case. The involvement of the FBI was particularly significant, as the agency's behavioral analysis unit had developed sophisticated methods for profiling serial killers and predicting their behavior patterns. These techniques would prove essential in understanding Ramírez's victim selection criteria and hunting patterns. The breakthrough in the case came with the discovery of one particular victim whose murder provided crucial forensic evidence. John Jairo Amador de la Rosa was found dead, his body wrapped in ropes in a manner consistent with Ramírez's established methodology. The condition of Amador's body and the specific way he had been restrained provided investigators with detailed evidence of the killer's methods. More importantly, the crime scene yielded physical evidence that could be traced back to the perpetrator. Faced with the forensic evidence linking him to Amador's murder, Ramírez made a crucial tactical decision. Rather than maintaining his innocence, he chose to confess to this particular killing, though he would not admit to the full scope of his crimes. In 2012, after a 5-year killing spree that had terrorized motorcycle taxi drivers across northern Colombia, Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre was finally captured by Colombian authorities. The exact circumstances of his arrest remain somewhat unclear, but it appeared to result from the comprehensive investigation coordinated with international agencies. At the time of his capture, Ramírez was 32 years old and had been operating as a serial killer for approximately 5 years. His arrest brought an immediate sense of relief to the motorcycle taxi community, which had been living in fear of becoming his next victim. During his initial interrogation, Ramírez attempted to minimize his involvement in the crimes and provide alternative explanations for his actions. However, the physical evidence against him was overwhelming, and investigators had developed a comprehensive understanding of his methods and victim selection patterns. Following his arrest, Ramírez was formally charged with multiple counts of murder in connection with the motorcycle taxi driver killings. Initially, he was reluctant to provide a full confession, admitting only to the murder of John Jairo Amador de la Rosa, where the physical evidence was irrefutable. However, as the investigation progressed and more evidence was presented, Ramírez eventually acknowledged responsibility for additional murders. He admitted to killing 23 men, though investigators believe the actual number was much higher, possibly reaching 60 victims over his 5-year crime spree. During the legal proceedings, Ramírez attempted to provide alternative explanations for his actions. He claimed that he had been ordered to murder the taxi drivers by a paramilitary group, suggesting that his crimes were politically motivated rather than the work of a serial killer. Authorities thoroughly investigated Ramírez's claims about paramilitary connections, but found no evidence linking him to any organized crime groups or political organizations. His assertion that he was following orders was determined to be a fabrication designed to minimize his legal culpability. Psychological experts who evaluated Ramírez concluded that he exhibited clear psychopathic tendencies and antisocial behavior patterns. His ability to charm and manipulate victims, combined with his lack of empathy and remorse, fit the classic profile of an organized serial killer. The psychological evaluation also noted Ramírez's intelligence and planning ability, which had allowed him to operate undetected for 5 years while committing regular murders across multiple jurisdictions. His crimes demonstrated a level of sophistication that distinguished him from more impulsive or disorganized killers. Following his trial, Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to 57 years in prison. However, in accordance with Colombian legal procedures, his sentence was later reduced to 34 years after he accepted the charges against him. The sentence reduction for acceptance of charges reflected the Colombian justice system's practice of providing incentives for defendants who cooperate with the legal process and acknowledge their guilt. This policy was designed to encourage confessions and potentially help solve additional crimes. However, the reduced sentence was controversial, given the scope and severity of Ramírez's crimes. Families of victims and advocacy groups argued that 34 years was insufficient punishment for someone who had systematically tortured and murdered dozens of people. Under Colombian law, Ramírez will be eligible for release in 2032 after serving 20 years in prison, due to the standard reduction of sentences to 3/5 of the original term for good behavior and other factors. This means he will have served only 20 years for crimes that claimed at least 30 lives. The prospect of Ramírez's release has raised significant concerns among law enforcement officials, victim advocacy groups, and the general public. Given his systematic approach to serial killing and apparent lack of remorse, many worry about the risk he might pose to public safety upon release. Colombian authorities have not yet announced specific plans for monitoring or supervising Ramírez after his release, though such measures would seem essential given the nature of his crimes and the methodical way he selected and victimized his targets. The crimes of Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre had a profound and lasting impact on the motorcycle taxi industry throughout northern Colombia. Drivers became much more cautious about accepting passengers, particularly those traveling to isolated areas or requesting transportation to the outskirts of cities. Many motorcycle taxi operators began implementing new safety protocols, including working in pairs, maintaining communication with dispatchers, and avoiding certain types of fares that had become associated with the killer's methodology. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of workers in Colombia's informal transportation sector, leading to discussions about better protection and support for those whose livelihoods depended on providing services to strangers. The investigation into Ramírez's crimes provided valuable lessons for Colombian law enforcement agencies dealing with serial crimes. The successful coordination between local police, national authorities, and international agencies demonstrated the importance of collaborative approaches to complex criminal cases. The case also highlighted the need for better communication and information sharing between different jurisdictions when dealing with crimes that cross departmental or municipal boundaries. Ramírez's ability to operate across multiple areas had initially complicated the investigation. The involvement of international agencies like the FBI provided Colombian investigators with access to advanced profiling techniques and analytical methods that proved crucial to understanding the killer's behavior patterns and developing effective strategies for his capture. From a criminological perspective, the case of Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre offers important insights into the psychology of organized serial killers. His systematic victim selection, careful planning, and sophisticated methodology demonstrated characteristics typical of highly organized offenders. Ramírez's use of charm and charisma to gain victims' trust reflected a type of predatory behavior often seen in psychopathic killers. His ability to maintain a normal facade while committing systematic murders showed the compartmentalization skills that allow such individuals to operate undetected. The sadistic nature of his killing method, slowly torturing victims to death over several days while watching their suffering, indicated severe psychological pathology beyond simple psychopathy. This behavior suggested deep-seated needs for control and dominance that could only be satisfied through extreme violence. Ramírez's crimes occurred during a period when Colombia was dealing with several high-profile serial killer cases. His activities overlapped with other notorious Colombian killers, including Luis Garavito, who targeted children, and various killers who operated in different regions of the country. What distinguished Ramírez from other Colombian serial killers was his specific targeting of motorcycle taxi drivers and his use of their profession against them. While other killers might target children, women, or homeless individuals, Ramírez exploited the specific vulnerabilities of workers in the transportation sector. His crimes also demonstrated a level of geographic mobility and cross-jurisdictional planning that was more sophisticated than many other serial killers operating in Colombia during the same period. The case of the Monster of Tenerife received extensive media coverage throughout Colombia, particularly in the northern regions where the crimes occurred. Newspapers, television stations, and radio programs followed the investigation closely, providing regular updates on the search for the killer. The nickname Monster of Tenerife became widely recognized throughout Colombia, though Ramírez was also known by other monikers including the Rope Monster and the Dexter Creole. These names reflected both the geographic focus of his early crimes and his distinctive killing methodology. Public reaction to the case was characterized by fear, anger, and demands for justice. The motorcycle taxi community was particularly affected, as drivers worried about becoming the killer's next target and families feared for the safety of their loved ones working in the transportation sector. The case attracted attention from international criminologists and law enforcement agencies studying serial crime patterns in Latin America. Ramírez's systematic approach and cross-jurisdictional operation made his crimes a significant case study for understanding organized serial killing. Academic researchers noted the unique aspects of his victim selection and methodology, particularly his exploitation of the motorcycle taxi system. This targeting of a specific occupational group was relatively unusual in serial crime and provided insights into how killers might adapt their methods to local conditions. The international collaboration that led to his capture also became a model for how developing countries could work with more experienced agencies to solve complex serial crimes that exceeded local investigative capabilities. Despite Ramirez's capture and conviction, concerns remain about the potential for similar crimes in the future. The motorcycle taxi industry continues to be an essential part of Colombia's transportation system, particularly in rural and semi-urban areas. Law enforcement agencies have implemented new protocols for investigating crimes against motorcycle taxi drivers, including better coordination between jurisdictions and more systematic tracking of missing persons reports from the transportation sector. The case has also led to discussions about improving safety measures for motorcycle taxi operators, including better communication systems, GPS tracking, and training programs to help drivers identify and avoid potentially dangerous situations. As we examine the case of Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre, it is essential to remember that behind the statistics and criminological analysis were real people whose lives were cut short by his violence. The 30 confirmed victims, and potentially many more, were young men trying to earn honest livings to support themselves and their families. These motorcycle taxi drivers were members of their communities, sons, brothers, and fathers who provided an essential service to their fellow citizens. Their deaths represented not just individual tragedies but also losses to the communities they served. The families of Ramirez's victims have had to live with the knowledge that their loved ones died in extremely painful and prolonged circumstances. The psychological trauma of knowing how these men suffered has added an additional layer of anguish to their grief. The case of Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre has raised important questions about Colombia's criminal justice system and its ability to deal appropriately with serial killers. The reduction of his sentence from 57 to 34 years, and the possibility of release after only 20 years, has generated significant controversy. Critics argue that Colombia's sentencing guidelines are inadequate for dealing with the most serious criminals, particularly those who commit multiple murders with extreme cruelty. The prospect of Ramirez's relatively early release has renewed calls for reform of the country's penal system. Supporters of the current system argue that the possibility of sentence reduction provides incentives for cooperation and rehabilitation, and that even reduced sentences represent significant punishment. However, given the nature of Ramirez's crimes, many question whether rehabilitation is possible or appropriate. Today, more than a decade after Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre's capture, his case continues to influence how Colombian law enforcement approaches serial crimes. The investigative techniques developed during his case have been applied to other complex criminal investigations. The motorcycle taxi industry has largely recovered from the terror of the early 2010s, though safety awareness remains heightened. New technologies, including GPS tracking and mobile communication systems, have made it somewhat more difficult for similar predators to operate undetected. However, the fundamental vulnerabilities that Ramirez exploited, the need for informal transportation, the economic desperation of drivers, and the trust required between strangers, continue to exist and require ongoing vigilance from both law enforcement and the community. The case of the Monster of Tenerife offers important lessons for preventing similar crimes in the future. The success of the international collaboration in solving the case demonstrates the value of sharing expertise and resources when dealing with complex serial crimes. The investigation also highlighted the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously, particularly when they involve specific occupational groups or show similar patterns. Early recognition of serial crime patterns can be crucial for preventing additional victims. Perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrates the need for comprehensive support systems for vulnerable workers in informal sectors of the economy. Better protection and safety measures for motorcycle taxi drivers and similar workers could help prevent future predators from exploiting these vulnerabilities. Today, the towns and cities where Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre once hunted his victims have largely moved beyond the terror of the early 2010s. Motorcycle taxis continue to provide essential transportation services throughout northern Colombia, though with greater awareness of the potential risks involved. The case of the Monster of Tenerife serves as a stark reminder that predators can emerge from any society and exploit the trust and desperation of those trying to earn honest livings. His systematic approach to serial killing demonstrated that even in developing countries, sophisticated criminals can operate for years if proper investigative resources are not available. As Colombia continues to develop its criminal justice capabilities and strengthen coordination between different agencies, the lessons learned from the Ramírez case remain relevant. The importance of international cooperation, systematic investigation techniques, and comprehensive victim protection all emerged as crucial elements in combating serial crime. While Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre sits in prison awaiting his release in 2032, the impact of his crimes continues to reverberate through Colombian society. His case stands as both a reminder of human evil and a testament to the importance of vigilance, cooperation, and justice in protecting society's most vulnerable members. Behind the handlebars of trust and the hum of Colombia's motorcycle taxis, Luis Gregorio Ramírez Maestre turned opportunity into horror. 30 lives, perhaps more, taken in calculated cruelty, while a nation struggled to recognize the pattern beneath its own movement. These were not just victims, they were workers, sons, fathers, forgotten by policy, not by pain. If this story disturbed you, enlightened you, or reminded you of the silent dangers we overlook, please like, share, and subscribe to Weird World Wonders. We uncover the truths that travel beneath the surface, not to glorify monsters, but to honor the ones they hunted. Until next time, stay observant, stay connected, and never forget, sometimes evil rides in the seat behind you.